The dust had settled long ago, yet the room still held its breath as if waiting for someone to return and finally name the truth. The walls remained pale, the corners dim, and the air carried that faint stillness that clings to forgotten places. The investigator stepped inside with slow, deliberate movements, shoes whispering across the floor where time had refused to move forward. The case was unsolved, closed only in paperwork but never in understanding, and the silence of the room wrapped itself around him like a reminder of a promise left unkept. It began here, years ago, on a night when the world continued turning while one life quietly stopped. Her name had been Lena, age 27, a community college science instructor who lived in a modest apartment nearby. Known for her calm demeanor and private routines, she left very little of her life exposed to interpretation. No known disputes, no recorded concerns, no sudden shifts in behavior that would suggest someone had marked her path with intent. She had simply vanished from conversation, then reappeared here, this small, dim room on the edge of Phoenix, under circumstances that never formed a full narrative. The scene had been processed 100 times over in reports, diagrams, and photographed angles. Yet standing in it again produced a strange pull, as if each detail wanted to speak its own quiet version of what happened. The investigator let the sensation settle. The wooden chair near the window, the faint imprint on the carpet, the table with the scratch along its edge, each object stood where memory had left it, like ghosts unable to step forward or retreat. He had been younger then, newer to the department, and the case had pressed into him with the weight of expectation. But the answers had remained out of reach, scattered and brittle. The lack of resolution had stayed with him in subtle ways, shaping the way he read silence and caution, shaping the methods he later refined. Now, returning, he felt not nostalgia but an obligation, quiet, steady, unchanged. Lena's life, though gentle on the surface, held a depth he hadn't fully understood at the time. A daughter of 2 retired nurses from Yuma, she spent her early years surrounded by structured calm. She'd studied biology, worked part-time at a local lab before teaching, and maintained a circle of acquaintances rather than friends. Her apartment reflected her: organized shelves, muted colors, a life without excess. There were hints of a quiet curiosity, books left open, notes drafted but never used, a camera capturing small details of nature. None of it hinted at danger. The first responding officers had described the scene as strangely quiet, a phrasing that initially seemed more atmospheric than useful. But standing here again, the investigator recognized the accuracy. The room held silence not merely from abandonment but from something unspoken, something missing, something once present but now erased with deliberate care. He kept his breathing steady, letting memory reassemble itself piece by piece. He touched nothing. He stood near the old tape markings on the floor. He let the muted light filter through the blinds in thin slats, cutting the dust into drifting lines. Lena's file had said she attended a faculty workshop 2 days before her death, had returned home late, and had no recorded visitors. Yet investigators found the scene at a separate location, a place she had no documented reason to be. The night felt frozen still. The investigator closed his eyes briefly, recalling the early interviews, the uncertain statements, the witnesses who weren't sure what they had heard, seen, or imagined. In the earliest hours of the case, faint sound had mixed with speculation. A car door closing, a brief argument, the echo of something dropped. None of it fit cleanly. The puzzle remained incomplete. He opened his eyes again, letting the stillness settle like a preface to something overdue. This case had once been the beginning of his understanding of what silence can conceal. Now, in this return, the silence felt different, not oppressive, but expectant, as if the room itself knew what had changed outside its walls. as if it sensed that a small, overlooked truth was finally about to surface. The air remained calm, the past remained intact, but something unseen had shifted. And the investigator, standing among the remnants of an unresolved night, knew without haste that the case would not remain dormant much longer. 2. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. The following morning, the investigator was called back to the precinct with a message that carried an unusual weight. The evidence unit had logged an item discovered during a routine inventory review of archived materials. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden confession, no new witness stepping forward, but a small, unlabeled envelope misplaced within a larger box of unrelated files. It had been sealed at the time of the original investigation, but never properly. Such oversights happened, though rarely. Records from that period had occasional gaps, clerical errors, mislabeling, and the quiet disarray of cases that lingered unresolved. Yet the moment he saw the envelope, he felt that same subtle shift he'd sensed in the old room the day before. Inside lay a single photograph, slightly worn at the edges, taken on a standard 35mm camera. The image showed Lena standing outside her classroom building, sunlight across her face, holding what seemed to be a thin folder. She wasn't smiling, but she appeared aware of the photographer. Behind her, blurred but perceptible, stood a second figure, partially turned, head slightly lowered, posture stiff. The key wasn't the photograph itself. It had been in her belongings, dismissed as an ordinary personal photo, but the timestamp printed at the bottom. It was taken less than 24 hours before her death, contradicting previous assumptions about her final movements. She had reportedly left campus earlier that day, heading to run errands. Yet this photo placed her back on campus later than anyone had recorded. The investigator studied the image carefully. The background held a bicycle rack, a partially open door, a stray shadow stretched across concrete. Nothing that shouted significance. But the blurred figure behind her, height approximated between 5'6" and 5'8", build average, clothing indistinct, felt like a presence that had been waiting all these years to be noticed. There was more, a faint indentation on the back of the photo as if it had once rested beneath something thin but sharp. Perhaps a paperclip, perhaps a key. The investigator turned it under the light, letting the shadows reveal texture. Small, parallel lines, 4 of them, crossed faintly near the top. That detail stirred an old memory. Years ago, Lena had served briefly as a research assistant in a university lab that used specimen boxes secured with coded clips. Her colleagues mentioned she stored notes in similar fashion, meticulous, marked, structured. But there had never been a record of those notes after the investigation began. Why would a personal photograph bear marks consistent with her work organizational tools? The detail was small, fragile, yet undeniably intentional. It suggested the photograph had been placed somewhere meaningful, and that it was moved, possibly hurriedly, before being collected. The investigator logged the find formally. A reopened case required protocol, notifications, reassessment, but more than that, it required a return to the mindset he had abandoned after too many unanswered questions. He sat at his desk as the morning unfolded around him. Conversations drifted through the department, printers hummed, calls rang in uneven rhythm. Beneath all the noise lay a new, deeper quiet, the kind that precedes discovery. He placed the photograph beside Lena's old case file, aligning it with the position it would have occupied had it been found initially. The contrast was immediate. The file contained orderly reports, statements, maps, and evidence charts. But the photograph introduced an anomaly, a disruption of expectation. It didn't contradict the old record, it simply widened its boundaries. Only one person had been on duty the night the original evidence was, a junior officer at the time, now retired. His testimony had been procedural, concise. But now the investigator wondered, had he seen something he didn't recognize as relevant? Had someone else handled the photo first? The case reopened not with urgency but with calm precision. Each new step felt measured, nothing rushed, nothing assumed. And as the investigator studied the blurred figure in the background of the photograph, he felt the truth beginning to stir. 3 investigator examines, past reports to identify overlooked details. The archived reports were stacked neatly in the review room, boxes labeled by year, case number, and classification. The investigator pulled Lena's case materials onto the table, setting them down with deliberate care. The paper carried that faint scent of aging ink and time, the kind of smell that settles into the fibers of documents untouched for too long. He opened the primary folder, smoothing its edges before reading. The early statements remained unchanged. The initial witness at the scene, the responding officers, the paramedics who recorded the time. Everything appeared orderly, yet the structure felt hollow now, as if something small had always been missing but stayed unnoticed beneath the procedural surface. He began at the beginning. The first report noted a faculty member had mentioned seeing Lena the day before the incident, leaving the parking lot in a calm, unhurried state. That detail aligned with earlier assumptions. But a second statement, one he now realized he had never scrutinized deeply, came from a maintenance worker who believed he saw her later in the evening near the west courtyard. The report dismissed it due to lack of supporting testimony, and because the lighting at that time was poor. But now, with the photograph proving she was on campus later than believed, his earlier dismissal felt premature. He marked the report for reevaluation. Next, he reviewed a file of campus security logs. Card swipe records showed no entries under Lena's name for the hours between noon and midnight. But that data wasn't definitive. Faculty doors often remained unlocked during events or late study periods. The absence of a record did not rule out her presence. He circled another point. The investigator turned to the interviews with neighboring residents of the building where her body was found. Their recollections were scattered, shaped by routine rather than awareness. One resident mentioned hearing movement sometime after midnight but described it vaguely. Another said she saw a vehicle idling on the street earlier in the evening but could not identify make or model. These details, while thin, shared a common thread. They pointed to activity around the time and place where Lena was found, yet none were cohesive enough to build upon. The investigator leaned back, letting his thoughts settle with quiet discipline. He listened to the rustle of paper as he shifted through the pages, noting how the earliest hours of most investigations often produced a fog, uncertain recollections, incomplete impressions. The key to progress often lay not in dramatic revelations but in ordinary details. He returned to the photograph. Its timestamp contradicted the earlier assumption that Lena spent her final hours running errands away from campus. He studied the background again, focusing on the indistinct figure. The posture struck him now, slightly turned, weight shifted as if mid-step. Not casual, almost hesitant. He matched the photograph with reports of individuals present on campus that day. Faculty, staff, students. His eyes landed on a name he remembered vaguely, a teaching assistant who worked in the same department as Lena. His initial interview had been brief, his presence on campus unremarkable. The assistant claimed to have left early for an appointment. No inconsistencies had been noted. But the investigator looked at his schedule from that day. The appointment was off campus, and its record showed the assistant arrived late, nearly 30 minutes late. At the time, this had been meaningless. Now it became a thread worth pulling. He underlined the name. He read further, moving with the slow certainty of someone piecing together a puzzle using edges others had overlooked. A pattern began to settle, not clear, not conclusive, but distinctly present. Several individuals had been near Lena's orbit in the last days of her life. None unusual on their own, but when combined with the new photograph, the small inconsistencies appeared less random. He returned to the maintenance worker statement, seeing someone matching Lena's description near the courtyard. If that sighting was correct, the blurred figure in the photo might also have been present at roughly the same time. The investigator noted the alignment, a location, an unnamed presence. He lifted the photograph again, holding it at an angle where the faint lines on the back were visible. The marks resembled the imprint of a coded clip, the type used for lab note storage. That detail tugged at something deeper. Lena kept copies of her work notes in physical format as backup. If the photograph had been stored among them, then someone accessing her research materials could have removed it inadvertently or intentionally. He searched her file for documentation on the box of lab notes collected from her apartment after her death. The record stated, contents included assorted documents, notebooks, files, and personal items, all categorized under general evidence. No mention of a photograph, which meant the photo had either been placed after the inventory or removed prior. The investigator felt that quiet shift again, the subtle recognition that the case, once dismissed as static, now had movement, not sweeping but steady, logical. He gathered his notes, aligning them with methodical precision. His pen hovered over a blank page as he began to outline the inconsistencies, creating a clean map of overlooked fragments. The unexpected photograph. The unverified late evening sighting. The blurred figure. The assistant's delayed appointment. The unusual storage marks. The missing note box documentation. None of these alone solved the case, but together they formed a quiet current, guiding him toward something he had missed before. He closed the file slowly, the weight of unspoken truth resting on his hands. The room remained still, the past unchanged, but the path forward had shifted. The investigation, once silent, was beginning to speak. The investigator began with a list, not of names but of roles. Roles carried patterns. Who had access, who had reason, who had time. Names came later once the pattern held. At the top of the file, he wrote 4 labels in clean, steady handwriting. Colleague, assistant, support staff, evidence handler. Beneath each, he began to assign people. The colleague was Dr. Mason Heller, a senior instructor in the same department as Lena. In the earlier investigation, he had come across as composed and helpful. He had offered schedule logs, class records, faculty meeting minutes. His statement had painted Lena as quiet, capable, and reliable, someone he praised in general terms but never spoke about with detail. At the time, his cooperation had placed him outside suspicion. People who volunteered information rarely drew focus in those first days. The assistant was Noah Pierce, the teaching assistant whose appointment schedule now intersected with the new photograph. His original interview was short. He had said, "I left around 4, I think. I had to be across town by 5. The time had seemed reasonable, unchallenged. The delay in his arrival had not appeared important then. Now, the 30-minute gap carried a different weight. The support staff role included the maintenance worker, who claimed to have seen someone resembling Lena near the west courtyard that evening. His statement had been uncertain, his memory filtered through years of similar nights. He worked rotating shifts, often late, and his presence near that part of campus was ordinary, which meant he could have seen something small and important or nothing at all. And then there was the evidence handler, Elias Ward, the junior officer at the time, now retired. His name appeared in the early chain of custody records. He signed off on the intake of Lena's personal items, the collection of lab materials from her apartment, and the transfer of physical evidence to storage. Proximity through procedure, not relationship. He had never been considered a suspect. His role was administrative, structured, and neutral. The investigator set the 4 names in a vertical line down the page. Beside each, he began to add brief notes, access points, last known locations, documented interactions with Lena. Mason had shared an office wall with her. He had overlapping lecture hours. He had recommended her for a committee only weeks before the incident. Their relationship appeared professional, but shared spaces and shared responsibilities often created quiet tensions. The records showed she'd been considered for a class section he had requested in previous years. Noah graded for her, managed attendance, assisted with lab setup. He had routine access to her materials, her schedule, and her workspace. His appointment log placed him off campus that afternoon, but the documented delay raised a question. Where had he been during that half hour? Moved through buildings with a cart and key ring. His presence was often unnoticed, his routes habitual. People forgot who had been vacuuming near the hall, who had replaced the light in the stairwell, who had opened a door for a faculty member with full arms. Yet his statement, seeing a figure, hearing something, had never fully aligned with or contradicted the timeline. He existed at the edge of the narrative. And then there was Elias. He appeared only in procedural documents. No personal link to Lena was recorded. No shared meetings, no interaction notes. Just signatures, dates, and precise handwriting marking each transfer of evidence. When the investigator studied the chain of custody forms now, he noticed that Elias' name appeared more often than expected for a single case. He had taken extra shifts that week, covered for another officer, signed for items that could have been handled by others. The investigator began to schedule quiet, separate conversations. He met Mason first in a neutral office. Time had softened the lines on the older instructor's face, but his tone remained composed. He recalled Lena as methodical, reliable, and described their work with practiced clarity. "You two ever disagree?" the investigator asked. Mason paused. Not in any serious way, she was consistent. If anything, we differed on grading. She was more generous with marginal passes. The comment was mild, but the pause before it was not. The investigator logged it without judgment. Noah met him next. The assistant, now working in a different city, returned for the interview with quiet caution. His voice carried a faint uncertainty, as if revisiting that period loosened details he had packed away. "That day," the investigator said, placing the photograph on the table, "you remember leaving around 4. "Yeah," Noah replied, eyes settling on the image. I thought so." "Yet this shows Lena here later than recorded. Could you have still been on campus when this was taken?" Noah studied the photo, then exhaled softly. "Maybe. I might have stayed longer than I remembered. I was trying to finish a set of exam drafts. I didn't think it mattered at the time." The investigator watched his posture, his careful phrasing. There was no alarm, only a quiet effort to reconstruct a forgotten hour. No denial, but no clear admission either. Met him in a quiet room near facilities. The maintenance worker's memory came in pieces, colored by work rhythms and time. "I remember the courtyard," said. "I remember someone there. I can't swear it was her, just someone. I heard something, a door maybe, nothing loud." "Did you see anyone else nearby?" the investigator asked. A small shake of the head. I wish I could say more. Back then it all felt normal. Those early hours often did. Finally, the investigator reached out to Elias, now living a quiet life outside the city. The retired officer agreed to come in, his tone polite and steady over the phone. His role, at least outwardly, was simple. He had handled boxes, logged items, followed procedure. Yet the misplaced envelope and missing documentation from Lena's lab notes now made his presence stand out in ways it never had. When Elias arrived, he moved with unhurried steps, his expression measured. They spoke in a small interview room, its walls plain, its lighting even. "I remember the case," Elias said. "Not all of it, just pieces. It was a difficult time for the department." "Your signature appears on most of the evidence forms," the investigator noted. "You handled her personal and academic materials." "That was my assignment," Elias replied. "We were short-staffed. I took what I could." His answers were calm, reasonable. Nothing in his tone suggested strain. On paper, he remained the least likely among those who had stood anywhere near Lena's path, present but distant, procedural rather than personal. And yet, when the investigator reviewed his notes later, aligning timelines against roles, a quiet pattern emerged. 4 people, 4 positions around Lena's final days. One had professional overlap. One had direct support duties. One passed by in the background. And one had handled nearly every physical trace of her life after everything ended. The suspects did not feel like antagonists. They felt like people caught in the orbit of a moment that had never been fully understood. The investigator closed his notebook slowly. The case did not need more names. It needed clarity. And clarity, he knew, often came not from dramatic confessions, but from a single, small inconsistency that refused to align with everything else. 5 clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. The next days unfolded in quiet layers. No breakthroughs, no sudden admissions, just steady work, cross-referencing times, rereading transcripts, comparing phrasing from different years. The investigator moved through each page as though walking a familiar corridor, looking for a door he had somehow never opened. He began with Mason's records. The senior instructor's course assignments revealed a subtle pattern. For 3 consecutive semesters before Lena's arrival, Mason had requested a particular mid-morning time slot for one of his courses. The year she joined, that slot was reassigned to her. The department emails from that period showed polite, professional exchanges. Mason accepted the arrangement. His responses were measured, supportive. Yet a line in one message stood out. "As long as the department feels this arrangement best serves enrollment." The phrasing was not hostile, but neither was it completely neutral. It suggested a shift he tolerated rather than welcomed. Still, motive built on scheduling alone remained thin. The investigator made a small note, then moved on. With Noah, the thread was different. The teaching assistant's communication history with Lena revealed nothing overtly tense. Reminders about grading deadlines, clarifications on lab procedures,